Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. If you really care about immigrant justice, you should care about reproductive justice. My name is Yumhee Park, and I'm the Engagement and Mobilization Manager at the National Women's Law Center. We have a few technical notes before we begin. First, all lines will be on mute during today's webinar. Second, we'll be taking questions after our experts are finished with the presentation, but we encourage you to submit questions throughout the webinar. You can submit a question by typing it using the chat function. Finally, this webinar will be recorded and you'll receive a link to the recording of the presentation as well as a link to the slides within the next few days. At this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to Kelly Garcia, Director of Reproductive Justice Initiatives and Senior Counsel.
For reproductive rights. Before I turn it over to them, though, I want to take a minute to say just a quick word about the series. We've been doing this for quite a while with If, When, How. And so I want to give Lena Houston from If, When, How a moment to talk about the program.
Thanks, Kelly, and hi, everyone. My name is Lena Houston, and I'm the Director of Campus and Community Programs at the National Office of If, When, How. This is the second webinar in If, When, How and the National Women's Law Center's 8th annual series. We're really excited to be working together again, and we are so glad that you've joined us today. We have one more webinar scheduled this fall on environmental justice and reproductive justice. So if you haven't already registered for that, please do. In case this is the first time you're tuning into this webinar series, or if you may not be familiar with If, When, How, we are a national nonprofit that trains, networks, and mobilizes law students and legal professionals to work within and beyond the legal system to champion reproductive justice. We work with chapters on law school campuses across the country, our incredible reproductive justice federal fellows in Washington, D.C., state fellows in Seattle and Pittsburgh, and HIV fellows in Atlanta and Oakland, as well as a robust community of alumni and legal professionals. If, When, How believes that achieving reproductive justice will take thoughtful action and strategic activism, acknowledging the intersection of identities, collaborating across disciplines, and working toward a critical transformation of the current legal system, because ensuring that all people have the right to decide if, when, and how to create families depends entirely on if, when, and how hard we fight. On behalf of If, When, How, I want to give a big thank you to the National Women's Law Center, particularly to Kelly and Yumhee, as well as our esteemed presenters, Corey and Saye, for bringing their expertise to this webinar. Thank you again so much for joining us and for your interest in reproductive justice. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kelly.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Lena. And thank you to If, When, How for your continued support in doing this webinar series. So I just want to take a second to tell you a little bit about the National Women's Law Center. The center has worked for more than 40 years to protect and promote equality and opportunity for women and families. So we champion policies and laws that help women and girls achieve their potential at every stage of their lives, at school, at work, at home, and in retirement. And this webinar is part of our broader efforts to make sure that we are really bringing intersectional analysis and approach to our work and recognizing the ways in which we have overlapping concerns, even when they aren't particular areas that we work on specifically. Yumhee, can you go to the next slide? Okay, thanks. So this this series was really started, as Lena said, for about 8 years ago with the goal of trying to look at the ways in which social justice movements intersect, and in particular try to bring people who work in one area of social justice movements to think about and how reproductive justice intersects with that, and then also get people who are reproductive justice advocates thinking about the ways in which these other areas intersect and affect reproductive reproductive justice. And so I'm just going to take a moment to talk just a little bit about what the reproductive justice movement is. And so the reproductive justice movement was really created as a response to movements that that failed to really take into account the needs of communities of color. And it was founded by women of color to really represent and understand the ways in which we need to look at overlapping areas of discrimination and social injustice to understand how it is that people are living their lives, and then to work for, as Lena said, a world in which people are able to make the decisions of if, when, and how to have a child with dignity and autonomy. And so when we think about why we have this approach to overlapping issues, it's because all of those things affect that question of if, when, and how. So today we are going to talk about the relationship between reproductive justice and immigrant justice. Can we go to the next slide? So everyone, regardless of their immigration status, deserves to be able to make those decisions about their body's health, sexuality, and families with dignity and respect. And in order to do this, people need access to opportunities and resources such as healthcare, fair pay, time off to care for families, and they must know that they are safe in their communities. But currently, policies and practices that target women and families because they are immigrants prevent them from getting what they need to sustain their families. So we're living, as many of you know, in a really anti-immigrant time. We've seen the rollback of the Deferred Action Program, which allowed people who came to the United States as children to have a lawful status. And we've seen really harsh and increase in deportations and the ways in which immigration has been enforced. And we've also seen the administration try to place a ban on Muslims and from countries coming into the United States. And so we're seeing a really harsh crackdown on immigration, and that affects the ability of people to make those decisions for themselves, and it affects their ability to live their lives in the ways that they want to be able to. And so with that kind of brief introduction, I'm excited that we're going to be able to hear more about this from our two speakers. And so with that, I will turn it over to Corey.
Thanks, Kelly, and hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining today's webinar. My name is Corey Schindel, and I'm a policy associate at Kids in Need of Defense. And we are a nonprofit organization that provides pro bono legal representation to unaccompanied immigrant and refugee children in their deportation proceedings. We believe that no child should have to face court alone, and we work with law firms and law schools and corporations to help connect children with pro bono attorneys to fight their immigration cases. So as Kelly mentioned, and as you know, immigration policy has been headline news in recent months, and it's definitely a priority of the current administration. So today I wanted to focus specifically on unaccompanied immigrant and refugee children and on policies and enforcement actions that could affect or have affected this vulnerable group. So by way of a disclaimer, I won't be able to discuss any individual cases, either those of KIND or other organizations, but I do hope to give you a broad overview. So who is an unaccompanied child? An unaccompanied child is a refugee or immigrant child who comes to the United States without a parent or a legal guardian. And that's there is a legal definition. It's a child under 18 who has no lawful immigration status and who has no parent or legal guardian in the United States or a parent or legal guardian in the United States available to provide care and physical custody. And this is determined at the time of a child's apprehension. So if they're at the border, for example. So a child might have family in the United States, but if that family is not with the child when they're apprehended, the child is usually identified as unaccompanied. And there are certain protections in the process that go along with that identification. So while unaccompanied children have been coming to the US for decades, the numbers have increased dramatically in recent years. So as you can see, the numbers peaked in 2014, and you may have heard something about this known as sort of the surge. I'm sorry. And so more than 68,000 unaccompanied children arrived in the US in 2014. And you can see that in fiscal year 2017, which began last October, more than 28,000 children had arrived by April, and many more followed. We didn't have the data in here, but many more followed after that before the fiscal year closed in September. So the majority of these children and the children that KIND serves come predominantly from what's known as the Northern Triangle of Central America. And these are the countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And these are currently some of the most dangerous countries in the world. So why are these children coming to the US? Each child and family has a unique story, and there's many complex reasons that people make the decision to migrate. But what we know through our experience and through interviews with unaccompanied children conducted by other human rights organizations is that the majority of children are fleeing extreme violence and threats to their lives and safety. Gangs and gang violence are widespread in the Northern Triangle countries, and we know that children are particularly vulnerable. Violence is used by gangs to maintain control over territories, and many children are threatened and subject to forced recruitment or rape. And children often go into hiding and stop attending school due to fear of leaving their homes. So, which then makes them even more vulnerable to traffickers and other predators. Children also flee abuse in the home and sexual and gender-based violence, neglect or abandonment, or other vulnerable situations that you see here. So in the past several years, there's been a significant increase in the number of girls migrating alone. So historically, you would see younger men, perhaps. Now we see women, women with their families, and also young girls coming. And sexual and gender-based violence is widespread in the region, and most often the victims that we see for that are girls and LGBTI youth. So rape is frequently used by the gangs to discipline girls and women and their family members who do not comply with demands that the gang makes. And so girls, many aged 15 or younger, are often forced to become the girlfriends of gang members. So these are not girlfriends in the typical sense, they are forced relationships. And for girls who resist, they may be subject to sexual violence, and in some cases, they have been killed. So this is going to show some statistics about this. The child welfare systems in the region are nearly non-existent. They're unable to protect children, and the rates of sexual and gender-based violence are extreme, as you see here. So over 5,000 women have been murdered in Guatemala since 2000, and only 2% of these have resulted in convictions. So what we see in the region are high rates of impunity. That means people are seldom prosecuted or brought to justice. On average, for the region, less than 10% of reported cases will result in a conviction. And you see here that the violence is staggering and does not necessarily abate even in transit. On fleeing the violence that is in their home country, people will often experience it again in transit. So here you see 6 of 10 migrant girls, an estimated number, experience violence en route to the border and to the United States from traffickers, police, immigration officials, and others. So what happens when children, this is another statistic on the danger in the region and the homicide rates. And it's estimated that nearly 60% of children could qualify for international protection based on the violence that they're fleeing, either through asylum or other humanitarian relief. So on to arrival. So what happens when an unaccompanied child arrives in the United States? So children who come to the U.S. are usually first apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. And there are different procedures under the law for children from contiguous countries, such as Mexico, and those from non-contiguous countries, which would include the Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. For Central American children and anyone else from non-contiguous countries, CBP will first determine whether the child is accompanied or unaccompanied, and the child is placed in immigration removal proceedings. So if the child is considered unaccompanied, they are transferred within 24 hours to the custody of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, that's ORR. And ORR contracts with a network of state licensed facilities throughout the United States, and they range in care from shelters to more secure facilities. Those are placement decisions made by ORR. So federal law provides that children in federal immigration custody are supposed to be placed in the least restrictive setting appropriate to their needs. And through a long-standing settlement agreement in a case called Flores versus Reno, there's a presumption favoring the release of children from custody to their parents or other relatives while their immigration court proceedings are pending. And this is important because we know that prolonged detention can have significant psychological and emotional consequences for children, and particularly children who are fleeing the violence that you heard about today, child survivors of trauma. So typically what happens is children will provide information about parents or relatives or others they know residing in the United States while they're in custody or when they arrive, and ORR will reach out to potential sponsors for the child. And if a potential sponsor is identified, ORR then performs a background check for safety purposes, and the sponsor will complete paperwork to help ORR determine that it's a safe placement. Parents and guardians get priority in that process, and ORR prefers to release children to parents and guardians regardless of their immigration status. So an undocumented immigrant can serve as a sponsor. And so once approved as a sponsor, the child's reunified with them and released into their care. And then the sponsor agrees to provide for the child's food or shelter, clothing, care, their education, and they also make sure that the child will appear for their immigration proceedings. So since January, the president has issued several executive orders, and Kelly mentioned some of these. So I won't go into these at length, but what's important to know is that many of these could have an impact on the protections available to unaccompanied children, and they speak to sort of a larger and broader enforcement environment that Kelly was referencing that is currently affecting unaccompanied children and their families. So in January, the president signed 2 executive orders, including the ones on border security and interior enforcement. The border enforcement order provides for expanded detention, directs funding for border wall, expanded enforcement priorities, and it would change how asylum seekers and others are processed. And the interior enforcement order broadly defines enforcement priorities, so effectively anyone who is here without others' authorization would be subject to deportation. There's, of course, the refugee and travel ban order, which I'm sure you have heard about in the news and is subject to much litigation. And the administration just issued a new order related to that yesterday. And the White House has also recently announced principles and priorities that it considers essential for any deal related to DACA. And, you know, in our mind, these priorities cruelly include policies that would eviscerate many of the protections I spoke about earlier for unaccompanied children, so sort of trading the protection of one group for another, which we think is a non-starter and incredibly cruel. Tonight, I want to highlight an example of how the policies targeting unaccompanied children and their families are playing out. So in February, then Secretary of DHS, John Kelly, issued a memo implementing the executive order on border security. And that memo called for, and you see the language here, civil and criminal prosecution of those who facilitate the illegal smuggling or trafficking of an alien child into the United States. Following that memo, in June, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that's known as ICE, began conducting an initiative to target the parents and sponsors of unaccompanied children for enforcement and potential prosecution. During the summer months, hundreds of individuals were arrested as part of this initiative, during which agents appear to have used information provided by children and sponsors for family reunification purposes, either by children entering at the border or by parents or others as part of the sponsorship process. And they use that to question and conduct enforcement against the sponsors, essentially using family reunification, a foundational principle of child welfare law, as a weapon against the children and families. News reports and stories that have been shared with us suggest that the vast majority of individuals arrested have not been charged with smuggling, but instead are being charged with civil or criminal violations unrelated to smuggling or trafficking. And instead of breaking up smuggling rings and protecting children, which was the stated intent, the actions in reality have made unaccompanied children more vulnerable, separating their families, frustrating their access to legal protection, and causing lasting trauma to children who, as we've discussed, have endured and escaped unimaginable violence. So while some parents are available to sponsor children following these enforcement actions, others were detained in federal immigration custody following questioning. And those circumstances frustrate the ability of ORR, which is mandated under federal law to do so, to place children with safe and appropriate sponsors and in the least restrictive setting. And as a result, children may face prolonged detention as a result. So children are left with impossible choices when their parents are detained. They can identify other sponsors who may be fearful of coming forward and themselves becoming subjects of enforcement, or they can remain in custody indefinitely. And a concern that many advocates share is that children may choose to give up their legal claims for protection and ask to return to their home countries to be released from custody, even despite grave dangers. The actions also affect U.S. citizen children who could be living in the home when their parents are detained or deported, as those children may be placed in state child welfare custody if other caregivers are not identified. So the separation of families clearly has significant psychological and emotional impacts for unaccompanied children, and especially those who fled violence. And we know they rely on safety and emotional support from their parents, in particular, and from their families, to work through traumatic experiences. And this support is critical for children who are seeking legal protections, such as asylum or special immigrant juvenile status, as these require children to share details about their painful pasts in support of their claims. The detention or deportation of parents and sponsors is especially destabilizing to that process and to the sharing of information that's required. Parents and family members often provide essential context and documentation during the legal process to assist children's claims, particularly for young children who may not either remember circumstances or have access to the documentation themselves. And parents may share claims for relief, such as asylum, with their children based on the same circumstances. So when a parent is detained and access to that information becomes limited, that can result in children being unable to fully support their claims for protection. The ability of children to share their stories and to receive care and assistance as they navigate our incredibly complex immigration system is key to the fundamental fairness of our system and to the very well-being of children. Rather than targeting loving parents and sponsors who assist these children, the federal government should instead ensure that children have a full and fair opportunity to be heard and to secure the protection they are due. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Saye.
Great, thank you so much. Wait for the slides to come up 1 sec, please. Great. So thank you so much, Kelly, and hi everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and learn a little bit more about the connection between immigrant rights and reproductive justice. As already mentioned, my name is Saye Smiley. I'm the IFWN How Reproductive Justice Fellow at the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. And through this presentation, I will first broadly discuss what healthcare access for immigrants looks like, and then I will discuss what healthcare access looks like more specifically within certain immigration contexts. A few things to note before I do get started. First, I want to note that I will be using the gender-neutral term Latinx when applicable. However, because of the nature of data collection, some stats do reference women as cisgender women and or Latinas. And second, it goes without saying, but immigration does not equal Latinx, and Latinx does not equal immigrant. Latinx experiences are not the only immigrant experience, nor is it a singular experience. So admittedly, my talk will focus on Latinx experiences, but of course, intersectionality is key to each lived experience, and the immigrant experience is lived differently in accordance with race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, ability, or otherwise. So with that, let's get started. For some, it may not be immediately apparent why immigrant rights would be part of a reproductive justice framework, but as has already been explained, and I hope to contribute to the discussion, immigrant rights are deeply tied to reproductive justice. So can we get the next slide, please? Thanks. So as previously excuse me, as mentioned, reproductive justice will only be achieved when all people have the economic, social, and political power to make decisions about their bodies, sexuality, and reproduction with dignity and autonomy. So our immigration system and policies certainly have destructive effects and create hurdles in achieving reproductive justice. First, our conception of family, both in and out of the immigration system, is based on a heteronormative conception of the nuclear family, and which is tied to heterosexuality and a gender binary. The idea that immigrants are hetero families or come to the U.S. to have kids both shapes our immigration system and is perpetuated by our immigration system. And the next 2 points on the slide touch on the continued criminalization of immigrant communities through surveillance and detention, particularly targeting immigrant communities of color. And increased surveillance and detention shapes how immigrant communities navigate the world and are treated, and how immigrant communities are treated in it. And for example, whether immigrant communities are welcome in places like schools or hospitals, or another example, whether an individual feels comfortable with interacting with an agent of the government. And lastly, of course, our immigration system's backlogs prevent family unity, restricting people's ability to be with their loved ones and thrive. And by putting people in complex immigration proceedings, people are living with fear and a lot of uncertainty. Next slide, please. So I won't spend too much time on these next 2 slides, but I think it is worth mentioning, as sometimes we tend to forget how social and economic factors also come into play in our health. Systemic violence, for example, impacts people's ability to get the necessary medical care that they need. Connecting access, for example, to medical care, for example, to immigration status is one example, which I will go into with a little bit more depth later on. And some immigrant communities are overrepresented in industries that require exposure to health hazards and toxins. For example, Asian American Pacific Islander communities and nail salons, and indigenous Mexican folks in working in agriculture, both examples exposing employees to toxic chemicals. The next point is tied to the second. When working in a space with few or no workplace protections, going to work becomes a risk to one's health. And of course, if you live in a neighborhood with fewer resources or in a rural community where the closest healthcare provider is miles and miles away, you may be less likely to access the care that you need. Next slide, please. Affordable health coverage often also comes with strings attached. Many of our social benefits and programs exclude immigrants from access and solely based on immigration status. Oftentimes, access to employer-sponsored health coverage is limited as well. Immigrant Latinxes are often overrepresented in industries that are low wage and provide few to no benefits for their employees, including health coverage and sick days. And even when able to access healthcare providers, cultural and linguistic competence also presents a barrier. And of course, there's the policing of our communities. So take the state of Texas, for example, which I will discuss a little bit more later in the presentation. But the chances of going through an immigration checkpoint when you're driving to a clinic are incredibly high, especially in the Rio Grande Valley. And imagine not feeling well and you're not feeling your best self, and on top of that you're hesitant about seeking the medical help that you need because you know you're going to have to go through a checkpoint. Next slide, please. So here we have a graphic from Guttmacher that shows that immigrant women of reproductive age who had not obtained citizenship status had more than 3 times the uninsured rate of US-born women in 2015. And what this graphic shows is those who do not have citizenship status have a much larger uninsured rate than those who do have citizenship status, particularly those who live in poverty. And the estimated 11 million undocumented immigrants are not eligible for Medicaid or any federal subsidy to purchase insurance. And as we can see from this graphic, more than half of poor non-citizen immigrant women aged 15 to 44 remained uninsured in 2015. Next slide, please. So healthcare can be a bit confusing because it does vary from one state to another or even from county to county. This is a list of some healthcare options an immigrant who is documented may have, but even so, the federal government has imposed barriers to immigrants' ability to participate in affordable and public health coverage programs simply because of their immigration status, and despite their contributions to the workforce, to our families, our communities, and the tax base. So CHIP, for example, Children's Health Insurance Programs, is available to low and middle income families. Some states have immigration status restrictions and some do not. Emergency Medicaid, it only covers the emergency that places the person in serious danger. That is, only the treatment for the emergency is covered, but not ongoing care. Next slide, please. So these are the options available to someone who is undocumented. Under federal law, for example, hospitals are required to provide emergency room care to everyone, regardless of ability to pay or immigration status. That care, however, is quite limited, and care will only be provided to stabilize the person, but no ongoing medical needs would be addressed, such as physical therapy for accident victims or medication for chronic illnesses, such as diabetes. So it looks like someone who is undocumented would have some options, but it is important to note that this assumes that someone who is undocumented would have the resources to pay for these health services out of pocket. So in other words, cost does present another barrier to access. Next slide, please. So the problem here is that there is a healthcare coverage patchwork that is contingent on immigration status, and thus it contributes to this climate of fear. People are too afraid to seek out the services that are necessary because anything could lead to deportation, and thus people live in isolation and fear. And folks do not call the police for help, especially, for example, imagine if you are a Black immigrant and what that means to call the police, the physical and mental safety implications of that. Also, this climate of fear created by our immigration system works both ways, right? It also promotes hateful narratives about immigrants. So it creates fear of immigrants as draining of government resources. And for example, public charge is a legal ground of inadmissibility, meaning if someone is found to be inadmissible, they will not be allowed into the US, or their immigration status will not be adjusted to get a green card, for example. And the US Citizenship and Immigration Services defines it as someone who is likely to become primarily dependent on the government for subsistence, as demonstrated by either the receipt of public cash assistance for income maintenance or institutionalization for long-term care at government expense. So, and also perpetuates fear of immigrants having children. If an undocumented person is pregnant in the United States, they're commonly denied prenatal care, and also people have been forcibly sterilized, which historically is done under the premise of allowing immigrant women of color to escape poverty. Obviously, the reality is that is not how you fight poverty, and if anything, shown by the fact that families continue to struggle after even being forcibly sterilized, and along with the added trauma of being violated in such a horrible way. And lastly, that anchor baby rhetoric is really damaging as well. It ties also to the same idea as public charge, that people just come here to have children and seek citizenship through that way. Next slide, please. Oh, next one. Thank you. So health of detained immigrants. Sexual abuse allegations have come from nearly every state that has an immigration detention facility, signifying that it is a pervasive and widespread problem. According to a complaint filed by the California-based nonprofit Community Initiatives for Visiting Immigrants in Confinement, the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General received over 33,000 complaints of sexual and physical abuse by its agencies from 2010 to 2016, but it only investigated less than 1% of them. Trans and gender nonconforming detainees are commonly forced into solitary confinement under the premise of protection, but with no regard to what that does to a person's psyche. And trans folks are commonly denied necessary medical care, like hormone therapy, for example. And some reports show that trans detainees have even been forced to take libido suppressants. And when pregnant people are detained, ICE and its contractors are legally, actually, ICE has a policy against detaining pregnant people, but continues to detain pregnant people under what is supposed to be a small exception, but is not used that way. And even when detaining pregnant people, ICE and its contractors are legally required to provide appropriate medical care. However, detention conditions are completely inadequate, and some people have experienced serious delays even during health emergencies, which has even led to people suffering miscarriages in detention. And in immigration detention, as I'm sure people can imagine, there is just a general lack of access to comprehensive medical care, including abortion. And of course, lack of access to contraception, breastfeeding support, and also a quick mention of the Hyde Amendment, which is law that prohibits federal funding of abortion. Next slide, please. So I'd like to share with you the story of Victoria Arellano. Victoria was an HIV-positive trans Latina who was detained in San Pedro Processing Center in California. During her 2 months of detainment, she was repeatedly denied the antibiotics that she had been taking that helped prevent her from developing pneumonia. And ICE's denial of the care that she needed exposed her to several HIV/AIDS related infections, which ultimately resulted in her death. So while on paper it might say that the cause of her death was through those infections, ICE denying her the simple antibiotics that she needed was what ultimately resulted in her death. And prior to her detention, Victoria was in good health. Next slide, please. So in Texas, Texas used to have different healthcare programs for folks, but recently did away with all of the different healthcare programs that it offered, and now has consolidated all state-funded healthcare into a program called Healthy Texas Women's Program. Under Healthy Texas Women's Program, there's a chance for those with a green card, so in other words, a lawful permanent resident, to access health care, but there are no funds coming from the state to help undocumented folks access health care. And generally in Texas, any policy discussions involving health care leaves out undocumented folks. And people with green cards have a little bit more luck, but although sometimes are left out as well. In the Rio Grande Valley, which is predominantly immigrant and undocumented families, there's only one healthcare clinic that provides abortions, which is located in McAllen. And the clinic, by the way, in McAllen is the center of the whole Women's Health Supreme Court, the case that made it up to the Supreme Court. Many people currently cannot get services elsewhere, and it may be their only clinic at all for different services. And because of the region that the valley is in, folks have to deal with ICE agents and Border Patrol agents. So in reality, it's three-pronged immigration enforcement, because there are laws in Texas that, like SB4, that really embolden local law enforcement to act as de facto immigration agents. So folks have to worry significantly more because there are so many different government entities to worry about. So we at National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health have received calls about ICE and Border Patrol agents being parked outside of healthcare clinic parking lots, which of course deters people from going to their appointments. And we've been talking to people in healthcare clinics and holding kind of know your rights sessions and letting folks know that clinics have the right to tell law enforcement that they have to leave the parking lot, that they can't be there without a warrant. So there are many reasons for someone not being able to make a trip to a healthcare center, from knowing that there will be checkpoints, and maybe folks don't have a license or access to transportation, and the actual distance itself, right? Texas is a huge state. There are language barriers as well, and the fact that many families cannot take off from work for a day or two and save money to make the trip. So back to the example of going to the McAllen clinic, the Whole Women's Health in McAllen, for an abortion, just because it is a legal right does not mean that everyone has access to it. Next slide, please. Perfect. Oh, sorry, can you go back one sec to the, awesome. So I wanted to share with you another story coming out of Texas about Jane Doe, which has been very widely seen in the news recently. So Jane Doe is a 17-year-old woman who came to the U.S. on her own from Central America and is currently in a government-funded shelter in Texas under the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which, as previously mentioned, is the federal office charged with caring for unaccompanied immigrant minors once they enter the U.S. So upon her arrival at the shelter, Jane found out that she was pregnant and requested an abortion. She went before a judge in Texas to get a judicial bypass to obtain the abortion, and the court granted it. But the new federal administration, however, had crafted a policy that allows the Office of Refugee Resettlement to veto an unaccompanied minor's abortion decision. And after going through all the legally required steps that Jane needed to fulfill, to get her abortion, including mandatory counseling as required under Texas law, the federal government used this policy to not let her leave the facility for her abortion. The government did, however, take on several measures, including transporting Jane to a crisis pregnancy center to try to coerce Jane out of her decision. And so today, we received the news this morning, actually, that more than a month after she made her decision and after a lot of back and forth in the courts, Jane was able to get her abortion and is doing well. And while Jane did get the care that she needed, the administration's policy does remain in place. And there are many more young people being held in federal detention facilities who are right now being denied the ability to get abortion care, and at the same time being coerced and shamed for their decisions following the administration's hateful agenda. Next slide, please. So one more story I'd like to share with you coming from Texas. In 2015, Blanca Borrego went to her gynecologist appointment in Houston with her two daughters, 22 and 8 years old. And when the clinic staff told her they needed to update her records, Blanca, who was undocumented, handed them a fake driver's license. And the clinic staff took it upon themselves to make sure that Blanca and her children stayed in the waiting room while they called the sheriff's department, which soon arrived and arrested Blanca. Blanca, when she was arrested, she was taken away in handcuffs in front of her two daughters, and she was charged with a felony related to having fake documentation, which was found in her purse. So Blanca and her family at that point had lived in the US for over 12 years. And it's hard to imagine how, after hearing stories like this, how immigrant women are expected to trust health professionals and seek out support. Her family did work with local community organizations to hold the clinic staff accountable in their role in her arrest and to bring attention to the lack of access to safe health care for immigrant women. The clinic was eventually fined $2.4 million as HHS found that it acted in violation of privacy rules under HIPAA. But none of that money went to Blanca. 6 months after her arrest, Blanca pled guilty to possessing fake documentation in exchange for a reduced sentence of 40 hours of community service and a $200 fine. And of course, a criminal conviction does put her at higher risk for deportation. Next slide, please. So I briefly want to talk about DACA, and in the interest of time, I will try to keep it brief. Just to provide a little background for those that may not be as familiar, on September 5th, the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, announced that the DACA program will be rescinded. So DACA grants its recipients work authorization and protection from deportation for 2 years, subject to renewal. And it currently protects nearly 800,000 undocumented immigrants from deportation. Dreamers, which is how those protected under DACA are sometimes called, pay taxes but are not eligible for federal welfare. And Dreamers, though, can lawfully hold a job, purchase a home, attend college without fear or threat of deportation. And currently, no new DACA requests or DACA renewals are being accepted. And once a DACA recipient's benefits have expired, they are no longer protected under DACA at all and subject to deportation. And Dreamers are not eligible for coverage under the ACA, under the Affordable Care Act, and in a few states, Dreamers may be eligible for state-funded Medicaid or CHIP programs, but again, it just depends on location. And Dreamers, for example, who are in school or work could possibly facilitate easier access to health coverage. And currently, Dreamers are living under incredible amounts of fear and uncertainty because the future is really unclear in terms of protection and what will result with DREAM Act and DACA protections. And with that, I will turn it back over to Kelly for Q&A. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great, thank you both so much for this wonderful presentation. We have a fair number of questions. One that I wanted to kind of kick us off with is a question, and because you had didn't bring up HIPAA, so we did have a question about what are the protections for immigrants who are seeing a doctor under HIPAA in terms of their privacy when they're showing identification?
Right. So I think as illustrated this is Saya, by the way, as illustrated by Blanca's case, so there is precedent that a clinic informing law enforcement about an undocumented person in the clinic is a violation of HIPAA. I'm off the top of my head, I'm not familiar with what exact provision that would be, but I'm happy to give out after the presentation some more resources and information on HIPAA more specifically as it relates to immigration status.
All right, great, thanks. And then we have a question specifically about DACA. So with the termination of DACA, how can we best support Dreamers in all aspects?
Yeah, so I'm very happy you asked. So I would encourage everyone to contact your representatives and really, really push Congress that they can't leave in December without passing a clean DREAM Act. And I think that a DREAM Act, the DREAM Act, if anyone isn't particularly familiar with the bill, but it would not only cover DACA recipients, but it would also protect people who wouldn't have even qualified for DACA. And there are already cases of DACA recipients being detained, et cetera, so things are moving rather quickly on that end. And so we really do need a clean DREAM Act now, and hopefully Congress will be able to vote on it by December. And yeah, please contact your legislator.
Great, thanks. And then we have another question that's directed to Corey. So is it what ICE is doing illegal, using family reunification and sponsors to track down undocumented children and their families?
So that's a great question. So when information in the sponsorship process is provided by a potential sponsor, so they fill out what's known as family reunification paperwork. And on it, they have questions about immigration status, addresses, other people living in the home, and that information is used by ORR to sort of make sure it's a safe placement. So they know where somebody is, so that if, for example, somebody is undocumented and was subject to enforcement at some point, that they would sort of know there were alternatives and that there was a plan in place for the welfare of that child that was being placed by ORR. So that process has always been in place as part of sponsor reunification process and the paperwork. And about just before someone is released from ORR to a sponsor, that information has historically been provided to immigration. And that was also for sort of child protective reasons. So if they had been looking into a local trafficking ring, or there was a pending criminal investigation, and they knew something that was not known, for example, to ORR, that would be a way that they would transmit that information back and forth to make sure that the child was in fact safe. That information historically was not used for enforcement purposes against undocumented sponsors. So it had always been transmitted as part of the process, but had not been used to go after sponsors, to target them, to question them, and certainly to target them for criminal prosecution. So that's just some context on the process. Certainly when the structure of ORR per Flores versus Reno, which is a longstanding settlement agreement that the federal government is bound by, and also provisions of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, the TVPRA. The agencies are charged with trying to find the least restrictive setting for children and to take into account their child's best interests. And we think obviously these operations frustrate the ability of ORR to place children that way, should sponsors be afraid to come forward and information for family reunification be used against them. So I think we'd certainly say that frustrates the spirit and the intent of the federal laws sort of guiding that process. Mm-hmm. But the information itself that has been transmitted as part of sponsor verification has always been provided. It's just by way of prosecutorial discretion, parents and sponsors had not ever been targeted using that.
Thank you. And then I have a question that's, I think, directed towards Saye. How can we better support undocumented people in their pursuit to reproductive health care, specifically abortion?
I'm so sorry, could you repeat the question?
Oh, how can we better support undocumented people in their pursuit to reproductive health care, specifically abortions?
Oh, yeah, great question. I would recommend just getting connected with local organizations wherever you are. They're the ones out there really with their ear to the ground and can best identify needs and really helpful ways to get involved and support immigrant communities.
All right, great, thank you. And I wanted to just give you both an opportunity, if there was anything that these questions have made pop into your head that you think is important before we close out. So we have about 2 minutes left.
I'll go ahead. I'll just reemphasize the craziness that is going on right now with Congress, and particularly with the DREAM Act. And I think to get a clean DREAM Act passed is crucial right now. But I also, I do also want to note, and I didn't mention it during the presentation, but also just to kind of put out there also the damaging narrative that also is a part of that. We don't want to think of good immigrants versus bad immigrants, or that through no fault of their own they came. Those types of narratives are also really harmful to immigrant communities. And so I think ultimately everyone who is undocumented should be protected. And so yeah, just to be mindful of that as well. And yeah, please contact your legislator about DREAM Act. Thank you.
And Corey, I did want to make sure you also had a chance to say just a little bit about what we have some law students, I think, on this webinar. So what can people do to help unaccompanied young people?
Sure. So one of the things Kids in Need of Defense does is to help connect unaccompanied children with pro bono counsel. And so attorneys at law firms, attorneys at law schools, or students at law schools, for example, clinics, people in corporate legal departments, can all serve as pro bono attorneys. So when children come, there is no right to government-funded counsel. When children are in detention, the government makes efforts to link them up with counsel, and we at KIND are generally a post-release legal services provider, and so we facilitate representation through a pro bono network. And so I think to the extent people are interested and able, certainly helping out unaccompanied children with their cases and in your communities is certainly an option, and you should feel free to be in touch with our organization. Or if you're at a firm or a law school, that's something we actively encourage. There is a greater need than can sort of be stated in terms of representation for these children, and their cases are incredibly crucial. And so I know that for many on the call, you may not have any immigration law experience, and this could possibly be the first time you're necessarily hearing about this. And just to assure you, that's true of many pro bono attorneys when they first start out taking cases, and there's sort of an active mentorship role that's played by Kids in Need of Defense attorneys on staff, and those who have taken cases before, and sort of making sure that you understand the process. There's trainings, and they serve as a mentor throughout and a resource. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested to get involved. We know that children with counsel obviously have a greater chance of winning their cases, and it's incredibly important that their stories be told. And as you can imagine, if you think of going into court alone by yourself to represent yourself, even if you are a law student or a lawyer, it's sort of an intimidating process to imagine that for a child who's come through a traumatic journey, maybe a child survivor of trauma and violence. To do that alone is almost impossible to conceive of, and we think a real question of due process.
All right, great. Thank you so much, both of you, for this wonderful presentation. And Yamhi, are there any last housekeeping things before we sign off?
Just want to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the recording within a few days.
Thank you.
Thank you.